everybody. So I'm going to break form a little bit and do a little bit of fiction. This is from a novel I'm working on. I wrote down selection from novel about horror, crime, and police, and the horror of police. Anytime I thought about quitting the police force, I thought about my dad. All the cops talked about my dad in this interesting way, like he was a hero, which isn't to say that they talked that way about all cops. They very much didn't. Sort of to my surprise, all those older cops were not blind to the problems of policing, and some had even taken part in trying to root them out. They were, I had heard once, a strange bunch, optimists wrapped in layers and layers of cynicism, of gallows humor, of stuff that helped them get through the day. But they also had guns, and all the bullshit they brought with them into the shop, the squad car, the police vehicle, and they drove around town with it, expecting to be able to solve every problem in the world. And when they couldn't, some of them tried harder and pushed and broke the law, and others gave up and sat quietly. But each and every one of them failed to do the aspirational thing, whether it took 2 years or 10. They all failed, and they had to sit with it, and sitting with it scared the crap out of them, and so they didn't talk about it, and they didn't think about it, and it drove them crazy. The academy wasn't horrible. They wanted me to have some college classes by the time I went, and I had that in spades. Although it wasn't criminal justice, which is what they wanted, I'd heard bad things about criminal justice, that sometimes those classes were taught by the worst kind of retired cop, the cop with a grudge against the system and a captive audience. I didn't see that, particularly because I didn't go that way. Sociology was where I went, the study of societies, which is very much what I felt like my dad might have done, is learn about how people are people. The physical stuff was a lot like what people complain about with everything else. There's no need to revisit any of this because it's not required. 6 months of my life in classes, drills, running, lifting, relays. We learned to write reports and how to deal with active shooters, terrorism, chemical gas attacks, but not how to talk to people. Lots of people in those classes were as young as I was. Some came from cop families. Some had the steely-eyed look you only got from serving, active duty, and a couple of people my dad might have called chuckleheads. Dudes who came in with all this stuff they'd learned on the internet about the sheep they'd be protecting. They were on the lookout for Middle Eastern terrorists and narco-traffickers, men on the lookout for weird haircuts, and the androgynous folk. Antifa, which was kind of like a slur when they said it, with as much power as the Black Panthers somehow, or some strange epic-level gang from some movie that never really existed in real life. The trainers tried to push these recruits, told us it was different out there on the job, in the field, riding around in a shop or a squad. They called it a shop because it was where you did your business. It was a blur of a whirlwind training, and then I was sworn in wearing dress blues, just 6 months, and then I was in the shop driving around Chicago, Inglewood, District 7. I didn't want to join the Cheval PD, although that was an option. I was trying to make a name for myself separate from my dad and the city I came from, so I moved to Chicago, big enough and far enough away to hide. My field training officer was a no-nonsense 15-year cop named Paul Keegan, a self-ascribed Mick who'd survived more captains in chief than he cared to count. He said he'd seen the city change. Sears became Willis. The Bulls lost Jordan, got Jordan back, lost Jordan again. He survived Lightfoot, which, like all the liberal dreamers in charge of the city, he said, turned out to be no more than smoke and mirrors. He'd survived Blagojevich, who, like all the crooked pieces of crap, eventually realized that milking money from a broke city was like trying to get blood from a stone. Keegan only knew my dad by reputation. Back in 91, what had happened? Some of the old-timers donated blood in Cheval that summer or worked on the union charity drives. What happened to your dad, Keegan told me? Not many 20-year folks see something like that. Nobody would have faulted your dad walking away after. That he didn't shows what kind of guy he is, what kind of cop. You not riding his coattails tells me what kind of guy you are, too. There were a lot of similarities from that horrible summer in 91 also, and what I experienced when I started. In 91, they were replaying the Rodney King beating over and over on just about every television. A horrible thing, but he admitted not uncommon at the time. L.A. had a reputation, too few cops trying to do what bigger departments did with many more. It hired right out of the Marine base, right near L.A., and so most of the cops still felt and acted like they were at war. And you? I asked him. Do you feel like we're at war? He looked at me like I'd grown another head. I was his P1, the lowest of the low. But he didn't run things like I thought a cop should, not like my dad, all piss and vinegar. Me? He asked. I want to go home tonight. I just assume everybody does. I try to make that happen. Keegan was a weird cop. One day we pulled this domestic between a guy and his girlfriend. They were literally killing each other, each of them covered in cuts and bruises. But as soon as we showed up, they turned on us, all that ire and frustration directed outward. Keegan said it was better, it was at us, than each other. We didn't make any arrests, which confused the hell out of me. These things happen in cycles, Keegan explained to me. We were in the shop later, sitting outside the Miracle Mile. I smelled like sweat, the smell of our shop, this empty, vacuous chemical smell. It's about police power, Keegan told me. Cops, especially Southern cops, they're descended from slave catchers. I mean, sure, some of it is respectable. The city watch derived from people who are part of the city itself, each taking a shift to protect it, switching shifts so nobody gets too powerful. But a lot of it is dealing with problems that aren't our bag. I can tell you young kids that it used to be worse, but in some ways it used to be better too. For a hot second there, I was walking a beat and knew everybody's name on the block. But then we were just trying for red light summonses because that's how the city made money, is people running red lights. I've seen it all. I'm young enough to remember when Nixon was considering a universal basic income. And to remember Clinton, the one they called the first black president, if you can remember that, came on stage and said that crime was very bad and that we would have to work to bring back law and order to the United States, and started 3 strikes. Keegan hated his body cam. Hated it. Said it was the worst thing to happen to cops, probably ever. I had to say something to that. Well, for me, I said, it feels like it protects the public. They know that I can't lie, make some stuff up, plus it keeps both of us safe if there's an incident. And he just smiled. That's very good, P1, but do you know what else it means? It means that people don't trust us to do what our charter says we should be doing. It means our bosses don't trust us. He paused. Gleaming lights like fire along the windows of skyscrapers on Miracle Mile. And if they don't trust us, we shouldn't be doing any of this at all. Then his chubby finger, like a hairy Chicago-style hot dog, poked at me. Tell this to you too, kid. If you see someone commit a crime and you get it on your body camera, can you give them a break? You feel comfortable just giving them a warning? I was quiet then. I couldn't give them a break. They'd come down hard on Keegan for letting me let something go. We'd have a conversation with the sergeant. If I was still in my probationary period, I'd be out for trying to let someone go, for trying to let someone not break the law. Us having discretion works both ways, he said. We can't help as much, but we can't hurt as much either. Body cams, they're terrible. He told me that as much as he thought that 3 strikes were dumb, that it simplified a complicated sentencing process. Crimes did go down after it was instituted. I laughed. Yeah, because everybody went in jail. No, he said, finger in the air. It was because the middle class expanded. Glass-Steagall. Clinton made it easier to buy a house. That meant that people with very little savings suddenly had equity, had money, and people with money commit less crime. Well, less of the crime that you and I deal with. They're still robbing each other on Wall Street. Keegan was a numbers guy. He pulled up a graph on his phone, a zigzag cut that dropped down out of nowhere. That's the Arab Spring, he said. What's that line measure? That's the price of grain. I got another one that shows unemployment for adult males under 35 that's very similar. Same time. I wanted to tell him he sounded like a conspiracy theorist, that he was leaving stuff out of his assumptions, but he was also my commanding officer, and I'd always been a bit of a brown-noser. To be honest, I wanted him to like me. I wanted to get from him something my dad had never given me, a fair shake. Plus, he was doing something my dad had never done, talk. Hey, Officer Robledo, he told me, think about what you think what you want to think about all this. But stuff is connected, not just connected, beholden. The world is beholden to rules that change constantly, and people expect it to affect nothing. He told me you don't get to 20 years as a cop fighting every battle, flailing and whining about whatever new project or program comes down from the mayor or the governor's office or from central command. You come in, you do your job, you help as many people as you can, and you collar as many idiots as you need to, and not a goddamn one more. And you got to know you're swimming in a great big ocean with too many variables you got no control over. Politics, cop politics, the law, the black markets, the gray markets, public opinion, street opinion, racism, The goddamn specter of racism, generational wealth, indifference, and bullshit. Redlining, he yelled once out loud. We were sitting outside at an ice cream cone shop on one of those heat wave days where the sweat made everything stick to everything, and it seemed like all of Edgewood was fighting all of Edgewood. And restrictive covenants, too, of course. He pointed at the brownstones, all these old houses. Kids ran in and out of the sprinklers, and a mom sipped a can of Coke from a straw on her front porch, pursing her lips at us, which, fair, having us sitting there was the opposite of comforting to her, especially in Edgewood, but we were hot too. Can you imagine what this neighborhood might look like if it had been allowed generational wealth, he asked me, or if any of the housing projects had been funded correctly. He held out his ice cream cone, and it took me a moment to realize he wanted me to cheers mine with his. Sprinkles scattered over the pavement, and I almost lost my scoop. With Keegan, it was strange. I had expected cops to be like stoics, like soldiers in this endless war, heroes from some 2-bit television drama. But Keegan talked. Keegan never stopped talking, which at first was frightening because I was trying to absorb it all, thinking it might be on some future test. But not one of my exams, the P100 or the entrance exam, had ever used the phrase restrictive covenant. Of course it didn't, Keegan said. It makes your job harder to have the context. You learn the context later. Context takes time. It's why community policing was such a big deal. Make the new guys who want to be superheroes provide support and rapid response teams, and have the veterans, and here he cleared his throat and puffed up his chest, actually work on making the community safer. I learn everyone's name, they trust me. I learn their stories, they learn mine. Then I'm not just some white D-bag with a gun poking my head into other people's business. I had my problems with being a cop. I'd seen other cops do messed up stuff, and then seen other cops in the presence of doing something messed up go absolutely silent. I'd seen them lie for each other in front of their wives and twist up somebody they didn't like. Keegan, to all of this, said I needed to keep my mouth shut, lest I get a reputation as a guy who other guys couldn't trust. He said that even if they were dirty, if I was ever an officer in distress, I still needed them. I needed them to respond so that I wouldn't just hear the sound of static if I ever needed help. My dad had never talked about being a cop as an honorable job. It was a job, presumably one he could do without a college degree and without the sort of manual labor that had driven his own father into the ground at 55. Dad hated the Cheval winters, hated wearing double layers of thermal, sitting outside in a squad car and waiting, he said, for idiots to be idiots. For as scary as my dad could be when he was yelling, he hated conflict, but he was also easily frustrated, which made him into the kind of scary cop that put the fear of God in people. If you pissed him off, something was very wrong, they said, but you saw a whole different version of Billy. He didn't consider it an honor because of what he'd seen very early, the dark side, the places where the rules couldn't reach and didn't cover, how justice was cold and biting and meant to be impartial, and so what he often found on the streets was heat, was blood, was revenge-taking and bitterness and prejudice. And because he was Mexican, he just took it, because that's what you did, because he was good at nothing else, and he didn't ever want to hear only that sound of static on the goddamn radio. He held the line. What's wrong with you? Keegan had been staring at me. My ice cream cone had melted down my hand, and a moving line of black on the sidewalk was already starting to steal it away. Sorry, I said, just trying to make some sense of things. Nah, he said, crunching on the end of his cone. You want your rules back. Remember rules? Remember being a little kid and being told, go to school on these days, and then you got the weekend and you can do whatever you want. And then you found out about summer and you lost your little mind. But every year around mid-July, you started to get afraid at the end of summer, the coming of the structure. But the structure is what makes the summer good. It's what holds the summer together. He pitched the paper end of his cone in a garbage, wiping his hands on his black trousers. But now it's all summer, kid, and you're scared. What you really want is that world of rules back, where everything makes sense and nobody's expecting you to make up your own mind. I can't give that to you. To be honest, you don't want it. I worked with Keegan for about another year. He didn't get shot or anything, just took an early pension when the city offered it. The older cops were too expensive. To me, it seemed like the dumbest stuff that the city could do. He lives in some suburb now, and sometimes he calls to check in, ask me how I'm doing. And I lie, and I tell him I'm fine, and I'm going to do this forever.
Thank you so much, Joe. Come back up here. I wanted to do a little impromptu conversational interview with you.
Totally.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about your background as a writer and what spawned you to share that story.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So I've been, so I'm originally from Joliet, Illinois. My dad is a Mexican police officer in the story. I've been writing a horror story about small towns and like the surrealness of being a minority in a place where white cops are overrepresented, and then the strange nuance of having a dad who's a Mexican, who's very much like hid in plain sight for his whole life. I've been thinking about that a lot as my cousin recently became a cop, and he's been telling me a lot of stories about my dad that he's hearing from other cops. And it kind of opened my eyes to just navigating this really interesting space of being both the victim and the victimizer.
Right.
So I'm trying to write about that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I really like a lot of the sociological elements that you involve, because I studied sociology myself and when I went to college, and that perspective is very removed, and it gives you a lot of perspective on all the different systematic oppressions. So it was nice to hear all those, and how you eloquently put them in the story was really cool.
Thanks.
Thank
you.
As well as the imagery, for sure.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Cool.
But yeah, where can we find more of your stuff? Do you have anything published out there that we can find?
Yeah, sure. I have a couple of things online. Blunderbuss Magazine, Anathema Magazine, and Action Spectacle. I'm working on the book right now, but if you want to hear me read, I do readings sometimes at Lighthouse Writers Workshop.
Great.
I also teach them classes for them. So
excellent. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Appreciate that.